Yes, thank you, Simon. And yes, welcome to this talk on meadow creation in urban green spaces. I'm the Conservation Officer on Big City Butterflies project, which is a 4-year National Lottery Heritage funded project working across 17 inner London boroughs and looking to inspire Londoners to discover butterflies and moths and connect them with nature and their local green spaces. So I'm going to tell you just a quick introduction to the project. We have these 3 main themes. So recording and monitoring, where we're doing training workshops, for example, in butterfly identification and recording, with the aim of establishing more butterfly and moth recording across the project area. My colleague Ellie is an engagement officer on the project, and she's doing a number of different school workshops, different engagement events and high footfall events across London. And then I lead on the habitat management side of things, and that's providing site management advice, doing habitat management training workshops, and this is both with community groups and with different councils and their contractors. And we also have a conservation budget for things like seeding and planting, including tree planting as well. So just really to give a bit of a context in terms of what's happening to our wider countryside butterflies. I'm sure many of you may be aware, but it's not only some of the rare butterflies that are in decline, but some of the wider countryside butterflies, and some of these are meadow species, for example, like the Essex skipper in the top left here, declined by about 88% over the last 40 years. Small skipper here, 75%, small heath. So there's some quite significant UK-wide declines, and that's including meadow species. So the more we can do to improve the quality of meadow habitats, but also the quantity, is really going to help support some of the recovery that we'd like to see in these species. Thankfully, in London, we've got quite a significant amount of green space that can really help support and provide some of that habitat, including designated nature reserves like sites of special scientific interest, local nature reserves, sites of nature conservation importance, and then the many parks and gardens. So nearly 50% of London is green. So that's a fantastic resource, and particularly obviously in London, but in many other urban areas, there's numerous areas of green space, including things like roadside verges, which can really contribute to supporting biodiversity. And in the case of inner London, we know that those green spaces support over 25 species. And actually, over the last 30 years or so, some of those species are doing reasonably well, and actually new species are colonising some of these sites as they are being managed a bit more sensitively and there's more care for the environment. So some of those species are highlighted in the blue there, so woodland or canopy species like purple hairstreak and white letter hairstreak that rely on different tree species. And then for some of the newer meadow species like marbled white shown in the image there, a grassland butterfly that needs unimproved and quite careful management to provide the right conditions. And then ringlet is another one that needs longer grass that's not cut down all the time. Yeah, it's good to see that some butterflies are being able to take advantage of that and are colonising some of the green spaces in London. But there's always more we can do, and we want to provide more and better meadow habitat to connect different green spaces. Yes, so the caterpillar food plants that are important in meadow habitat, things like bird's-foot trefoil, which is the food plant for the common blue butterfly, common sheep sorrel for the small copper, different fine grasses, so that's things like bents, fescues, meadow grasses, support quite a few different species like meadow brown and gatekeeper. But then also coarse grasses, so that's the ones you might more commonly find in the sort of richer grasslands in London, like cocksfoot and Yorkshire fog, support different skipper butterflies and ringlet butterfly. Nectar resources obviously quite important, those food resources for the adult butterflies. So some of the common species that you might find in London's meadows are things like knapweed, oxeye daisy, scabious, marjoram, different vetches, and yarrow. Shelter is very important in terms of the adults being able to set up territories, providing warm basking kind of conditions, and also for egg and caterpillar development. So that's having that availability of tall grass. Overwintering refuge areas are important, yes, for that hibernation period, for eggs and caterpillars, but also the chrysalises and the adults as well. And that's things like dead grass and grass tussocks that need to be left in situ over winter to enable them to complete that life cycle through the winter and into the following spring. So yes, just in terms of some of the grasslands that are out there, our best grasslands actually for wildflowers, bees and butterflies develop on the poorest soils with fairly low nutrients, and so lots of plants are able to compete for those limited nutrients, the nutrients that are available, and coarse grasses can't dominate. So this image is kind of a chalk grassland slope that you can see there. The grass is fairly thin. There's obviously lots of wildflowers, these are all cowslips, so this sort of demonstrates or will have fairly thin, free draining soil that gives rise to this very rich wildflower habitat where you can have up to 40 different plants in 1 square metre. And it's those kind of principles that we can use when we're thinking about grassland management and how to maximise the biodiversity. So in terms of those nutrient levels and the fertility, it's useful just to think about what soil fertility does to grassland. And you can see just by this comparative image here on the left, on the left, there's an area of verge which had a thick topsoil, and you can see how lush and green the growth is there, and the coarse grasses, those broadleaf kind of grasses, are already dominating. It's high fertility and there's few gaps for germination. And this is a verge literally just down the road where I think they'd actually run out of topsoil. So there's no topsoil being added to this verge. And you can see the difference between the two in terms of much finer grasses, more herbs, indicating lower fertility, and there are gaps for germination for other wildflowers to colonise. And again, we can think about that in terms of the grassland management and these two specific ways of managing grassland habitat that are often seen in urban areas. And the image on the left with the thick, lush grass indicates it's would be mown, but then the arisings or the cuttings are left on the grass, and that adds nutrients back in, or the nutrients is recycled into the soil and really encourages more grass growth and this lush growth with no gaps for germination, very few wildflowers and lots of coarse grasses. Whereas the image on the right is a verge that's been managed by cut and collect over a period of years, and that's where the verge is mown, but the cuttings are collected up and removed from the site. So the nutrients aren't added back into the soil, and that encourages finer grasses which are able to compete for those limited nutrients and lots of wildflowers. And we can then sort of consider that soil fertility when we're looking at different grasslands in urban green spaces, and consider how best to enhance them and what the soil conditions are like and what the diversity is like within different grasslands. So this is some images of a park in Greenwich Park, in fact, and the habitat there suggests a lower fertility soil because it's generally more fine-leaved grasses with reasonably good herb coverage within the grass. The grass is fairly thin and there are gaps in it, which hopefully you can pick that up on this image on the right hand side in particular here, with the herbs sort of spread through the grass. And this would indicate again a sort of thinner soil, lower fertility, and one that may be managed by cut and collect, where those cuttings are removed, and that helps to encourage the finer grasses and the wildflowers. And in contrast to that, these images kind of illustrate where grassland might be higher fertility and have relatively low or very little biodiversity. So that the green lush growth is dominated by coarse broadleaf grasses, the image on the left. There are very few herbs, and it's quite thick and there's no gaps, and would probably suggest this is managed by cut and leave, where the nutrients are allowed to recycle back into the soil. Or the image on the right would suggest there's no cutting or very little cutting, and it's sort of indicative of a rank grassland, which again can be dominated by coarse grasses and has few wildflowers, so there won't be not many nectar sources. So we can then consider whether soil fertility needs to be reduced, because we've established that low soil fertility really helps boost biodiversity. So there are a number of different methods we can use to address those fertility levels within the grassland. So the higher fertility, we would aim to reduce those nutrient levels, and there are three different options that we're going to talk a bit about to try and achieve that. The first of those is repeat cut and collect, where you can do 3 cut and collects, and removing the arisings, removing the cuttings in 1 year. So for example, in April, July and September, allowing the grass to grow long between each cuts, and then each cut helps remove all that material, all that biomass, and drawing nutrients out of the soil, will then begin to help reduce the dominance of coarse grasses and provide more gaps for wildflowers. The second option is physical removal. So that can be turf removal, for example, which takes that top grass layer off completely to allow bare ground for seeding, and to provide a sort of suitable seed bed. And taking that one step further on a more nutrient-rich site, you can actually remove the topsoil itself. So going a bit deeper down into the soil, roughly about 6 inches, to remove that layer of topsoil, to expose the lower nutrient subsoil underneath, for potential seeding into that soil. The third option is importing low nutrient soils to bring in the right kind of soil to then establish a more diverse and rich meadow in the longer term. The second two are obviously a bit more invasive, a bit more involved, and potentially more costly. But the first one is certainly something that could be done fairly simply and easily, and I'll talk a bit more about them. So those 3 methods, you can then do the scarification, which may be needed in the first option to create the bare ground, patches of bare ground that may be required, and it's at that point that you can then seed with a meadow mix to introduce that diversity of wildflowers that you want to try and get established. So on the right-hand side, where we talked about a lower fertility grassland indicated by the finer grasses and the herbs, you won't need to reduce the fertility so much, particularly if it can be maintained by cut and collect. But you can then, if you want to, improve the diversity and introduce more nectar sources, more food plants. You can do some scarification to create those bare patches, and again seed with the meadow mix to introduce that greater variety that we like to see, that's going to support more butterflies and pollinators. But yeah, it's that ongoing maintenance by cut and collect that's really important to get into place, because that can help maintain and improve grasslands in its own right. So just to illustrate some of those methods and give a few more examples, this image shows that this cut and collect method, where the longer grass on the left here is cut and left, or just topped, and you can see how long and lush and thick it is, whereas the grassland just on the verges here, in comparison, had those 3 cut and collects over the course of 1 year in 2017, and that produced much shorter, finer grasses the following year. So it can have quite an impact, just that change in the management. And you can see that already there's more wildflowers appearing on this bank here. Another example of that shown here. So this was once regularly mown amenity grassland, very boring with very little diversity. So again, it had those 3 cut and collects that were started in 2017, then seeded in the autumn, and then it was wildflower meadow. Took a couple of years to get going, but you can see the abundance of wildflowers in that area. And then to help the kind of aesthetics, and just to make things look neat and tidy, they do maintain this meter sort of strip around the edge, so that it doesn't all flop onto the path, which is quite a nice tip. So there are different, just to give you an idea of different cut and collecting methods. So on the top left here, this is called a flail collecting machine. Many councils and local authorities, or some, own this type of machine, or they have contractors that can come in and use them. And this machine both cuts and collects the grass all in one go, but then does fill up and then needs to drive to an area either on site or have a collecting sort of system where cuttings are taken off the site and composted. So either an option, but that certainly needs to be planned in, what you're going to do with the cuttings or the arisings. Top right is cut and bale, so a kind of baling operation where cuttings are, the meadow is mown and can then be baled up, and a sort of hay cut taken. On a smaller scale, bottom left just illustrates some community groups where the council might not have the collecting type machinery on a smaller scale. If the park managers or council can do the cutting, then volunteers, for example, can rake up to make sure the cuttings are removed, and habitat piles could be made on the edges, for example. Then certainly in urban areas, and particularly with verge management, this is a little ride-on cut and collect machine that some councils have invested in urban areas, and that works very well and leaves quite a neat finish as well. So following the cut and collect methods, you may find you need to create some bare ground for the seeding if you want to improve the diversity, and that's what we call a scarification, and you're looking to create around 50% bare ground, so that you've got a suitable kind of seed bed, if you like. Yeah, you can actually use this same flail collect machine, set the machine a bit lower, and that can scuff up the ground following that final kind of autumn cut and collect, and help create some bare patches for seeding. These images on the left is rotivation, so you can get machinery that will just turn over the top layer of soil and help you prepare and get that seed bed that you need to get the seeds in and established. Again, on a smaller scale, this is at Park King Square Gardens in London. If you're working on a smaller scale with community groups, you can do it by hand. So this is an area of fairly thin grass where we want to try and establish some more wildflowers, of creating those bare patches with a hoe by hand. Oops. So in terms of the seeding, you've got a few different options which I'll just describe. So one option is green hay, which is taking a hay cut or crop from a nearby species-rich site, and that ensures you've got good local provenance of seed from a nearby location, you know that seed mix, if the soil's been prepared right and the nutrient level isn't too high, that seed should take and do well in a new site. You can buy a meadow seed mix from different suppliers, such as Emmersgate. Normally they have majority native perennials, which is what we want to see, and also different grasses. And they can have both fine grasses and coarse grasses. In some instances, and particularly in urban habitats, cornfield annuals are sometimes included, like corn marigold and cornflower. And in the first year, these annuals come up and give a bit of a colour display, and will flower more quickly than some of the native perennials, and almost act like a bit of a nurse crop for the native perennials that probably won't flower in the first year, but will allow them to develop. But it is important to clear off those cornfield annuals at the end of that first season, and then the native perennials will come more established in the second year. So we normally suggest a rate of around 2 grams a square metre, especially if you've got your bare patches and you've addressed the soil fertility. That should be sufficient, and once the plants have germinated and begin to flower, they will obviously create their own seed source as well. There are different mixes available, and we recommend a chalk mix for chalk or neutral soils. It's got a really good diversity of wildflowers that are going to support lots of different butterflies, and just a rough costing there, about £12 for 100 grams, which would cover about 50 square metres. And you'd hope to see some of these different species in the mix that do well in many different soil types. So some of those plants, Burgess Park, common knapweed, oxeye daisy, yarrow red clover, and lady's bedstraw. One of the options I mentioned, in addition to cut and collect, is importing low fertility soils. So this image just illustrates that at Burgess Park in Southwark as part of a restoration project. They brought in a kind of sandy gravel soil for seeding. And you can see this is still in fairly early developments, but there's lots of birds for trefoil, lots of red clover, some fine grasses in there. So that variety is there's lots of herbs and wild flowers in there, and it's not dominated by grasses at all. And that means that in the longer term, you should maintain that high diversity. And also there's going to be less maintenance because you don't have that abundant growth that you might get in a higher fertility soil. And that variety will help support lots of different species. So the common blue in the bottom left there, large skipper, meadow brown, marble white will begin to colonise and use some of the different food plants there, and the grasses, and you should hopefully see numbers increase because of that. So the other option I mentioned about was topsoil stripping or turf stripping. So here, this is just an illustration from Coney Hall in Bromley, a recreation ground, where the top left image shows an area where there were some fine grasses, and this area was being managed as a meadow, and it was being managed correctly in terms of the cut and collect done with kind of volunteers, but it was fairly species poor, and there weren't many nectar sources or wildflowers for butterflies, and we chose this area to create a butterfly scrape effectively, where the digger, you can see here, scrapes away that roughly 6 inches of topsoil to expose the lower nutrient subsoil underneath. The cost of this, I think, was about £1,500 or so, and you can get a day rate for diggers, for less than £500 in some cases. And then we worked with the local community group there to do the seeding, and they're doing some plug plants here. So in addition to the seeding, you can buy plug plants of some of those species that I mentioned to put in and just help give it a boost and help establish some of those wildflowers more quickly. And yes, so this was created in autumn and seeded in autumn 2020. It did have a few annuals in the mix, so the poppy that you can see here. But yeah, by the following summer, later on the following summer, it's already looking pretty green, and quite a few wildflowers in there, like the knapweed, and I can see some kidney vetch in there, and the yarrow. So it's given it a boost in a fairly short amount of time. So the turf stripping obviously doesn't go quite as deep as topsoil removal, and you can hire. We hired a kind of turf stripping machine for this little project at Gladstone Park in Brent. I would add that this machine is mainly designed for lawns and lawn stripping, so it did struggle in areas of thicker grass. So it's probably only suitable for areas of quite thin grass, or there's an area of clover actually that we were able to strip quite effectively. And that almost creates just a bit of a biodiversity hotspot, if you like, and a feature alongside a path was something that we were keen to do, and the community group was really keen to do and work with us. These turf strips haven't quite fully established yet, but these images below kind of illustrate what you might get from a wildflower strip, if you like. And the image on the bottom left shows some of those annuals that I mentioned, the cornflowers and the corn marigolds, that if they're included in the mix will come up in that first year and give you that show of colour. And some pollinators, bees, will use those. And then this is the same on the bottom right, is the same wildflower strip, I think a year or two later, and now the native perennials, the oxeye daisy there, campion, are coming in and establishing, and that's what we want to see in the longer term. And that would now be managed by a cut and collect it in the autumn to remove some of that vegetation, allow it to establish again the following year. So just a quick note on yellow rattle seeding. Often yellow rattles called the Meadow maker. You may well have heard of it, but I'll explain a bit about yellow rattle. So it's a native wildflower that parasitizes grass. So it takes nutrients and kind of water from the grass and reduces grass growth. So it's one that if you can get going will help kind of control grass, if you like, and allow space for more wildflowers. It's one that must be sown in the autumn because it requires a cold period. So you need to disturb the soil a bit like we're doing, and you can see in those images in terms of creating those bare patches. Sow the seeds and tread them in. Don't bury them. In this case, we used a bit of sand just to give it a very light covering. And this image on the right hopefully shows the difference and the impact that can make in this sort of comparative image, where on the left you can see this is all yellow rattle becoming established in this grassland area, and the grass is much thinner, and on the right there's been no yellow rattle seeding, and you can see that the grass is much thicker and more dominant. So in terms of that process, in year one, that's when we'd sow the yellow rattle in the autumn, and then in year two, do your autumn cut and remove, and it's at that point that you could sow wildflower seeds once the grassland and the sward is a bit more open and less dominated by grass. You could potentially plant some wildflower plug plants as well. And then in year three, you continue that autumn cut and remove, and you can sow more seeds again if necessary. So just to give you some examples now of some of those different methods and some of the work we've been doing with big city butterflies. This is Beckenham Place Park in Lewisham. So we've been working in partnership there with the park's staff. And this is a meadow area that's been managed for quite some time as a meadow and is cut and collect for quite a few years, but is still fairly species poor. But there are fine grasses and herbs and some gaps there. So based on that assessment, we wanted to do some seeding to really encourage more wildflowers and establish more of a meadow habitat with greater diversity. And we used two different methods as a bit of a trial to compare and contrast on this particular site. So the first one in the top right here, we rotivated over 1,000 square meters. And then you can see that some of the local volunteers doing some seeding here with a meadow mix. And on this particular site, because we know there are plenty of coarse grasses there, we had a meadow mix which just included fine grasses to provide some of the fine grasses that some butterflies need. And the other method we did on this site was the turf stripping to create those sort of feature wildflower strips, and these we seeded in different ways. So some had the meadow and grass mix, wildflower and grass mix, and others just had wildflowers. So we can see kind of the difference that makes. So at Clapham Common, work in partnership with different community groups there. They're very active community groups that do a lot of good work on the common and are able to raise funds for habitat improvements and also working with Lambeth Council. And you can see the image on the top right. They had already created some wildflower strips in a similar way to that I've described, but they wanted to sort of extend that and do more and increase the diversity. And they found that some of these strips did need a fair bit of maintenance, and some of the coarser grasses were kind of coming in again to the wildflower areas. So the objective was to create more species-rich habitat that's going to last longer, if you like, with less maintenance. And so topsoil removal was selected as the best option for that in this area that you can see on the bottom right of the screen. It's an area that Lambeth had designated as a kind of naturalised or low mow area, if you like, but again it's dominated by ryegrass, very species poor. So this is the sort of grand plan we came up with at Clapham Common, where we're going to remove 150 millimetres of topsoil, and that will expose the low nutrient subsoil underneath. So these three grey areas here are all going to be scraped back and the topsoil removed, and the topsoil will be used to create bunds or banks around the edge of each kind of scrape or meadow area, and that will help provide some shelter for the meadow areas and the invertebrates, the butterflies, but also give a bit of protection from people. It's a very well used, high profile site on Clapham Common. So it will help define these new meadow areas and give them a bit of protection from people. And this is a pathway. It's not a sort of paved path, but this is a kind of desire line path through the middle. So people will have good access and be able to view and enjoy these scrapes. But we've kept this sort of low bund. They will be a bit lower alongside the path just to help sort of define it. Yes, the design, these will also incorporate scrub planting to help provide more shelter and other caterpillar food plants like buckthorn and blackthorn, good for birds as well, to help give a real biodiversity boost to the common. We'll be removing or moving approximately 400 tonnes of topsoil. So this is a bigger project, and we're talking in the region of around £10,000. And that the local community groups have fundraised in the past and are actually paying for the majority of this particular work. So that's great to see, and we're starting on this very soon, and we will get the seed down very soon, as soon as it's done in spring, and then potentially follow up with some plug planting, working with the local community group in the autumn to help engage different community groups and get some more planting in there to help establish the banks. And the topsoil banks are more likely to just grass over in the longer term, and they won't be the species-rich habitat that the scrapes will be. But actually, we're gonna just seed these banks as well, because we may get some wildflowers coming up in the first few years on the topsoil banks as well. But it's these subsoil areas that are really going to be species rich and last a long time. They will still need some maintenance, and may need the annual cut and removal, but certainly a lot less than some other meadow habitats. Brockwell Park. We're working here again in partnership with some of the community groups and with Lambeth Council, and these are some existing kind of meadow areas, but again they're fairly species poor, so we want to improve them. They've got the right management in place with the cut and collect mowing, but we are recommending the 3 cut and collects, roughly April, July and September, of this area, highlighted in blue, to reduce the nutrient levels, open up the grass, reduce the sort of dominance of coarse grasses. We can then, if we need to, scarify and do the seeding of that area, and that will be a sort of bit of a trial area, and we'll see how that goes. And then that approach can be replicated in other areas, so we can fill in these gaps in different meadow areas as we go, to hopefully transform the whole of this grassland area in over the next few years. Lambeth were keen also on creating some kind of feature wildflower strips, indicated by these kind of lines on the map. So as people walk in and enter the park, this is one of the main routes up to the kind of cafe and some of the buildings in the middle of the park. So there's an opportunity there to put those in and give an extra boost and have some wildflower habitat along there as well. And yes, with any luck, some of those species that I mentioned will benefit and colonise, and we should see numbers increase. And we'll be working with some of the local community groups to encourage more recording and monitoring, so we can measure those results. So it's very important in terms of maintenance. When you're doing some of those improvements and you've done that seeding, the first year, the following year, if you like, it's important to control any kind of undesirable weeds, if you like creeping thistle and dock that could come in and take over. And then to get that first cut and collect in late summer, just to clear off the vegetation and make sure it's open for the perennials to continue development. And then in following years, generally general prescription is cutting once or twice a year, so in early spring before April, or in the autumn after August, and that ensures you're avoiding those kind of the most active life cycle periods for different butterflies when they're breeding and laying eggs and the caterpillars are feeding. So by avoiding those times, you're kind of ensuring that the life cycle can continue. And the normal prescription is an autumn cut. That's the main annual cut, and then if necessary, if things are looking quite lush and long, that's when you could maybe introduce an additional spring cut as well. Generally, we say avoid cutting the grassland too short, as many species require longer vegetation, and will use those tussocks for overwintering, for example. And yeah, always leave some part of the site uncut each year as refuge areas. So yeah, this is once your meadow's established. We'd recommend a third being left each year on a 3-year rotation, so that you've always got some that's left uncut, and it's not always the same bit, so that third might begin to decline if you always leave the same bit uncut. Just an example of that, I suppose, the egg of the small skipper butterfly is laid in the dead leaf sheath of the grass Yorkshire fog. The caterpillar hatches and immediately spins a tiny cocoon in which to spend the winter, and starts feeding on fresh grass leaves in April. So it really needs that habitat, the dead grass, right through the winter and into the next spring, where the caterpillar starts feeding. So it's important that that overwintering refuge isn't cut down at the end of winter, but left in place right through into the summer, and is then only cut at the end of the summer. That's just an example of a bit of overwintering refuge habitat that's been left. And yes, in terms of maintenance, I mentioned before about the importance of collecting. So removing clippings helps reduce the soil fertility, but where possible, if it can be left for a few days after mowing, that will allow wildflower seeds to fall and invertebrates to escape. It's not always possible to do that, but this is the cut and baling option there that does allow that to take place. So in summary, yes, it's the low nutrient soils and those nutrient levels that I've been talking about that are really important to consider, and it's the low nutrient soils that support greater biodiversity. We can achieve those and achieve lower fertility by design, by some of those different methods, particularly where you're creating new habitat and you've got some money to do that. You can design and get that low fertility design right in the first place, or just by changing the mowing regime and the grassland management, where cut and collect can help reduce those fertility levels to help enhance any seeding that you do and ensure that the seeding is going to be successful. So yeah, I would definitely say meadow creation is one of the most cost-effective and fastest ways to increase